The morning sun cast long shadows across the Strait ranch as George Strait stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, his weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee. At 73, the king of country music had seen countless sunrises over these rolling hills, but today felt different. Today, he was about to make a decision that would change everything. "Dad, are you absolutely sure about this?" Michael Strait asked, joining his father on the porch. At 45, Michael had inherited his father's strong jawline and piercing blue eyes, but none of his calm demeanor when it came to family business. George took a long sip of his coffee before responding. "Son, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The ranch had been in the Strait family for over a century, passed down from George's great-grandfather, who had first settled this land in the 1890s. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every weathered barn told a story of hard work, perseverance, and unwavering family values. The thought of outsiders conducting research on sacred family ground should have been unthinkable. But George had his reasons he couldn't yet share with his son. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, her university-issued Ford pickup truck kicking up dust as it wound down the long gravel driveway. She was a respected soil scientist from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in the unique mineral compositions found in central Texas ranchlands. Her research focused on how century-old grazing patterns and natural soil evolution could revolutionize sustainable agriculture. "Mr. Strait, I cannot begin to express how grateful I am for this opportunity," Dr. Mitchell said, extending her hand as she approached the porch. She was in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "Please, call me George," he replied, his famous smile putting her at ease. "And the pleasure is mine, Doc. This old land has seen a lot of history. Maybe it's time it helped write some new chapters." Michael shifted uncomfortably beside his father. As the ranch manager, he understood every aspect of their operation, from cattle rotation schedules to hay production cycles. The idea of scientists trampling through their fields with testing equipment and soil samples felt like an invasion. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael began, his voice carefully controlled, "I have to ask, what exactly are you looking for out here? We've been working this land successfully for generations. What could you possibly find that we don't already know?" Sarah had anticipated this question. Ranch families were notoriously protective of their land, and rightfully so. "Mr. Strait, your family's stewardship of this property is exactly what makes it so valuable for our research. We're studying how traditional ranching practices have created unique soil microbiomes that could hold keys to improving crop yields while reducing chemical inputs." She pulled out a tablet, showing them preliminary soil composition maps. "Your ranch sits on a unique geological formation where 3 different soil types converge. Combined with over a century of careful land management, we believe this property could provide breakthrough insights into sustainable agriculture." George nodded thoughtfully, but his mind was elsewhere. 3 months ago, his 17-year-old granddaughter Emma had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition called systemic lupus erythematosus. The doctors had explained how her immune system was attacking her own tissues, causing joint pain, fatigue, and potentially life-threatening complications. During one of his late-night research sessions, something that had become a habit since Emma's diagnosis, George had stumbled across a medical journal article about naturally occurring compounds in aged ranch soils that showed promise in treating autoimmune disorders. The research was preliminary, but it had given him something he'd been lacking since that devastating doctor's visit: hope. "When would you like to begin?" George asked, startling both Michael and Dr. Mitchell with his directness. "Well, I was hoping we could start with a preliminary survey next week, but..." "You can start tomorrow," George interrupted. "Michael will show you around the property and help you get set up." Michael's jaw tightened. "Dad, don't you think we should discuss this as a family first? Rebecca and Emma should have a say in this decision. Your wife and daughter will support whatever decision I make," George said firmly, though his voice carried a hint of the uncertainty he felt about keeping his true motivations hidden. As Dr. Mitchell drove away that afternoon, her mind raced with excitement about the research possibilities. The Strait Ranch represented everything her career had been building toward. An opportunity to study pristine, century-old rangeland that had been managed using traditional methods passed down through generations. That evening, the Strait family gathered around the massive oak dining table that had been handcrafted by George's grandfather. Rebecca Strait, Michael's wife of 20 years, served her famous chicken-fried steak, while Emma, their 17-year-old daughter, picked at her food with less enthusiasm than usual. "So, Grandpa," Emma said, her voice carrying the slight raspiness that had developed since starting her new medications, "Michael told me about the research project. That's pretty cool that you're helping advance science and stuff." George studied his granddaughter's face, noting the slight pallor that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. Emma had always been the light of his life, spirited, intelligent, and adventurous. Watching her struggle with fatigue and joint pain had been harder than any challenge he'd faced in his 7 decades of life. "Sometimes, sweetheart, we have to take chances on things that might seem unusual. You never know what good might come from it." Rebecca sensed the tension between her husband and father-in-law. As a former nurse, she understood the complex emotions that came with major family decisions. "George, I think what Michael is trying to say is that we're all supportive, but we'd like to understand more about what this research involves." "It's soil testing, Mom," Emma interjected, managing a small smile. "It's not like they're going to turn the place into a toxic waste dump. Besides, if Grandpa thinks it's a good idea, I trust his judgment." Michael pushed back from the table slightly. "Emma, it's not that simple. This ranch is our legacy, our livelihood. Once we open those gates to researchers, we're setting a precedent. What happens when the next scientist wants to study our cattle, our water sources, our family history?" "Son," George said quietly, "some things are more important than precedent." The weight of those words hung in the air like morning fog over the pastures. Michael had heard that tone from his father only a few times in his life. When his mother had passed away, when George had decided to retire from touring, and now. After dinner, Emma retreated to her room to work on college applications, though everyone knew she was struggling to maintain her grades while managing her condition. Rebecca began clearing dishes, and Michael stepped outside to check on the horses, leaving George alone with his thoughts. He walked to his study, a room lined with awards, photographs, and mementos from his legendary music career. But tonight, his attention was focused on a thick folder hidden in his desk drawer, a collection of medical research papers, treatment protocols, and experimental studies related to autoimmune disorders. One paper in particular had captured his attention: therapeutic potential of soil-derived compounds in autoimmune disease management. The research suggested that certain microorganisms found in aged ranch soils could potentially modulate immune system responses. It was cutting-edge science, largely theoretical, but it represented a possibility that traditional medicine hadn't yet explored. George had reached out to Dr. Mitchell not because of her agricultural research, but because her work on soil microbiomes intersected with the medical research he'd been studying. He'd crafted his invitation carefully, presenting the collaboration as an agricultural initiative, while hoping it might lead to discoveries that could help Emma. As he sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the tangible evidence of a life well lived, George grappled with the moral complexity of his decision. Was he wrong to pursue this avenue without telling his family? Was he giving false hope to himself? Or was he being a responsible grandfather who would explore every possible option to help his granddaughter? Outside his window, the ranch stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that had witnessed over a century of Strait family history. Tomorrow, that history would take an unexpected turn, and George could only hope that his gamble would prove worthwhile. The weight of secrets, he had learned, was sometimes the heaviest burden a family man could carry. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the ranch before dawn, her pickup truck loaded with soil sampling equipment and testing apparatus. The early morning air carried the scent of dew-covered grass and the distant sound of cattle beginning their day. She had barely slept, her mind racing with research possibilities and the magnitude of the opportunity George Strait had provided. Michael was already waiting by the main gate, his expression neutral but professional. As ranch manager, he had a responsibility to facilitate this project, regardless of his personal reservations. "Morning, Dr. Mitchell," he said, extending a thermos of coffee. "Rebecca thought you might need this." "That's incredibly thoughtful. Please thank her for me," Sarah replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I know this situation isn't ideal from your perspective, but I want you to know that I respect this land and your family's stewardship of it." Michael studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's start with the North Pasture. It's where my great-great-grandfather first settled, so it has the longest history of consistent management." As they drove across the property in Michael's ranch truck, Sarah was struck by the pristine condition of the land. The grass was healthy and abundant, the fence lines were perfectly maintained, and the cattle looked content and well cared for. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a carefully orchestrated ecosystem that had been refined over generations. "Your family has done something remarkable here," she said, pulling out her tablet to take notes. "The soil health indicators I'm seeing just from visual observation are extraordinary. My dad always said that if you take care of the land, it'll take care of you," Michael replied, his voice carrying a hint of pride despite his concerns about the research project. They spent the morning identifying potential sampling sites, with Michael providing historical context for different areas of the ranch. Sarah was particularly interested in a section near an old creek bed where the original homestead had been located. "This area has the deepest soil profile," Michael explained, "and it's been used for grazing continuously since the 1890s. If you're looking for long-term agricultural patterns, this would be your best bet." What Michael didn't know was that this particular area had also appeared prominently in the medical research papers George had been studying. The combination of mineral-rich soil and century-old organic matter created ideal conditions for the microorganisms that researchers believed might have therapeutic potential. Around midday, Emma arrived on horseback, riding Sage, her favorite quarter horse. Despite her recent health challenges, she was still an accomplished rider, and being on horseback seemed to energize her in ways that few other activities could. "How's the science project going?" she asked, dismounting gracefully despite the stiffness in her joints that had developed over recent months. Sarah was immediately charmed by Emma's directness and apparent genuine interest in the research. "We're making excellent progress. Your family's land management practices are going to provide incredible data for sustainable agriculture research." Emma studied the soil sampling equipment with curiosity. "What exactly are you looking for? I mean, dirt is dirt, right?" "Actually, soil is one of the most complex ecosystems on Earth," Sarah explained, grateful for Emma's interest. "A single teaspoon of soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. We're studying how different management practices affect these microscopic communities." "That's actually pretty cool," Emma said, kneeling down to examine one of the soil samples. "So you're basically studying tiny, invisible cities?" "That's a perfect way to describe it," Sarah laughed. "Each soil sample is like a different neighborhood with its own unique population and characteristics." Michael watched the interaction between Emma and Dr. Mitchell with growing unease. His daughter was clearly engaged and excited about the research, which made his own opposition seem petty and overprotective. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his father's decision than agricultural advancement. That afternoon, George joined them in the field, ostensibly to check on the research progress, but actually to observe Dr. Mitchell's work firsthand. He watched as she carefully collected samples, labeled them methodically, and recorded detailed notes about each location. "Doc, how long before you'll have preliminary results?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "The basic soil composition analysis will take about 2 weeks," Sarah replied, "but the microbiome studies will take several months. We're looking at identifying and cultivating specific bacterial and fungal communities that might have unique properties." George nodded, though inside his heart was racing. Several months felt like an eternity when Emma was struggling with daily fatigue and joint pain that seemed to be worsening despite her medications. "Grandpa, are you feeling okay?" Emma asked, noticing the concerned expression on his face. "You look worried about something." "Just thinking about the ranch's future, sweetheart," George replied, which was technically true, though not in the way Emma might interpret it. That evening, the family gathered for dinner again, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. Emma seemed more energetic than she had in weeks, excited about the research project and Dr. Mitchell's work. Rebecca was supportive but concerned about the long-term implications. Michael remained skeptical, and George was wrestling with the weight of his secret motivations. "I've been thinking," Emma announced over dessert, "maybe I could help with the research project. You know, document the process or something. It might make a good college application essay, how my family's ranch contributed to scientific discovery." Michael and Rebecca exchanged glances. Emma's enthusiasm for anything had been rare since her diagnosis, and they were reluctant to discourage her interest. "That's a wonderful idea, honey," Rebecca said carefully, "but you need to focus on managing your health and keeping up with your schoolwork." "Mom, I feel better today than I have in weeks," Emma protested. "Maybe being outside and doing something meaningful is exactly what I need." George watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and guilt. If his gamble paid off, if Dr. Mitchell's research led to discoveries that could help Emma, then his deception would be justified. But if it didn't, he would have raised false hopes and potentially put his granddaughter through unnecessary emotional investment. After dinner, Michael cornered his father in the study. "Dad, I need to know what's really going on here. You've never made major decisions about the ranch without consulting the family, and suddenly you're opening our gates to university researchers. This isn't like you." George looked at his son, seeing himself 30 years ago, protective, practical, and concerned about maintaining family traditions. "Son, sometimes a man has to make decisions based on information others don't have." "What information? What aren't you telling us?" George was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. "I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me. This research project could benefit our family in ways you can't imagine." Michael studied his father's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that had made George Strait a country music legend and a successful rancher. "Does this have something to do with Emma's condition?" The question caught George off guard, and his momentary hesitation was answer enough for Michael. "Dad, please tell me you're not chasing some kind of miracle cure. Emma's doctors are the best in the state. She's getting excellent treatment, the best conventional treatment," George corrected. "But what if there are alternatives we haven't explored? What if this land our family has worked for over a century holds answers that modern medicine hasn't discovered yet?" Michael sat down heavily in the chair across from his father's desk. "Dad, I understand the desperation. We all feel it. But false hope can be more dangerous than no hope at all. And what if it's not false? George countered. What if we have the chance to help Emma and we don't take it because we're too afraid to try something unconventional? Outside, the ranch continued its ancient rhythms under the vast Texas sky. Cattle settled in for the night, horses dozed in the pasture, and somewhere in the soil beneath their feet, microscopic communities that had evolved over more than a century of careful stewardship continued their invisible work. Neither George nor Michael could have predicted that their conversation was being overheard by Emma, who had come downstairs for a glass of water and stopped outside the study door when she heard her name mentioned. As she listened to her grandfather's explanation of his true motivations, Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for his love and dedication, concern about the burden he was carrying alone, and a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the answers to her health challenges could be found right here on the land where she had grown up. The secrets that George had been carrying were beginning to surface, and with them, the family would have to confront questions about hope, tradition, and the lengths they were willing to go to protect the people they loved most. Emma lay awake most of the night, processing what she had overheard. The realization that her grandfather was pursuing the research project specifically because of her condition filled her with a confusing mix of emotions. Part of her was deeply moved by his dedication, while another part worried about the pressure and expectations this placed on Dr. Mitchell's work. The next morning, she found George in the barn, tending to the horses as he had done every morning for decades. The routine seemed to calm him, and Emma had always enjoyed these quiet moments they shared before the rest of the world woke up. "Grandpa," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "we need to talk." George looked up from brushing thunder, his favorite gelding, and immediately knew from Emma's expression that their conversation from the previous night had not been as private as he'd thought. "How much did you hear, sweetheart?" "Enough to know that you're not doing this research project for agricultural advancement," Emma replied, sitting down on a hay bale. "You're doing it for me." George set down the brush and turned to face his granddaughter fully. At 17, Emma had inherited her grandmother's wisdom and her father's directness. But she also possessed a maturity that had been accelerated by her recent health challenges. "Emma, Grandpa, I love you for trying to help me, I really do. But you can't carry this burden by yourself, and you can't keep secrets from the family about something this important." George sat down beside her, feeling every one of his 73 years. "I didn't want to get everyone's hopes up if the research doesn't lead anywhere. I figured if it worked out, I could explain everything then. And if it doesn't work out, then at least I would know we tried everything possible." Emma took her grandfather's weathered hand in hers. "But what about Dr. Mitchell? Does she know the real reason you asked her here?" George shook his head. "She thinks this is purely agricultural research. I've been hoping that her soil studies might intersect with the medical research I've been reading about, but I haven't told her about the potential therapeutic applications." "Grandpa, that's not fair to her. She's basing her research methodology on agricultural goals, not medical ones. If you want her to look for compounds that might help with autoimmune conditions, you need to tell her." The wisdom in Emma's words hit George like a physical blow. In his desperation to help his granddaughter, he had convinced himself that deception was justified. But Emma was right. He was potentially compromising the very research he hoped would help her. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, a question that carried more weight than its simple wording suggested. "I think we should tell the family the truth, all of it, and then we should talk to Dr. Mitchell together about what you're really hoping to find." That afternoon, George called a family meeting. Michael, Rebecca, and Emma gathered in the living room while George stood by the fireplace, looking more nervous than he had before any concert performance in his legendary career. "I owe you all an apology and an explanation," he began. "The research project isn't what I told you it was." For the next 30 minutes, George explained everything: the medical research he'd been studying, his hopes that soil microorganisms might offer therapeutic potential for Emma's condition, and his communication with Dr. Mitchell under false pretenses. Michael's reaction was immediate and intense. "Dad, how could you make a decision like this without consulting us? This affects Emma's health, our family's expectations, and Dr. Mitchell's research integrity." Rebecca was more measured in her response, drawing on her nursing background. "George, I understand your motivation, but Emma's treatment plan needs to be coordinated with her medical team. We can't pursue alternative approaches without her doctor's knowledge." Emma, however, surprised everyone with her reaction. "I think Grandpa did what any of us would have done in his position. The question now is how we move forward." "Emma, honey, you don't need to defend this," Michael said. "Your grandfather should have—" "Dad, stop!" Emma interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that reminded everyone present of George himself. "Grandpa is trying to help me. Yes, he went about it the wrong way, but his heart was in the right place. Instead of arguing about what he should have done, let's figure out what we should do now." Rebecca looked at her daughter with pride and concern. "What do you want to do, Emma?" "I want to talk to Dr. Mitchell. I want to understand what her research might actually be able to tell us, and I want to be honest with her about why we're really interested in her work." George felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Are you sure, sweetheart? This could get complicated." "Grandpa, my life is already complicated. At least this way, we're all working together instead of keeping secrets from each other." That evening, Dr. Mitchell returned to the ranch for what she thought would be a routine progress meeting. Instead, she found herself invited into the family's living room for a conversation that would fundamentally change the nature of her research. "Dr. Mitchell," George began, "I need to be honest with you about why I invited you to conduct research on our ranch." Sarah sensed immediately that this conversation was going to be significant. "I'm listening." George explained the situation, with Emma occasionally adding details about her condition and treatment. As the story unfolded, Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to concern. "Mr. Strait, I appreciate your honesty, but I need you to understand that my research is focused on agricultural applications. I'm not a medical researcher, and I'm certainly not qualified to make any claims about therapeutic potential." "We understand that," Emma said. "But we were hoping that maybe your soil analysis could be expanded to include testing for the types of microorganisms that have shown promise in medical research." Sarah considered this carefully. "That would require collaboration with medical researchers and possibly approval from the university's ethics board, since we'd be moving from agricultural research into potential human health applications." "Would you be willing to explore that possibility?" Rebecca asked. "Obviously, we'd want to make sure everything is done properly and ethically." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the Strait family. George's hopeful determination, Michael's protective concern, Rebecca's practical optimism, and Emma's mature acceptance of both the possibilities and limitations they were discussing. "I would need to make some calls and probably bring in collaborators from the medical school," she said finally. "But yes, I think we could explore expanding the research scope. However, I want to be very clear about managing expectations. Even if we find microorganisms with potential therapeutic properties, the path from discovery to actual treatment is incredibly long and complex." "We understand," Emma said. "But at least we'd be doing something constructive with hope, instead of just hoping and doing nothing." Michael, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Dr. Mitchell, what would this expanded research mean for the ranch operations?" "Honestly, not much change from what we're already doing," Sarah replied. "We'd be taking the same soil samples but analyzing them for different properties. The main difference would be that we'd need to be more careful about contamination and chain of custody for any samples that might be used in medical research later." As the evening wore on, the family began to envision a path forward that was built on honesty, collaboration, and realistic expectations. George's secret had been revealed, but rather than destroying trust, it had opened up possibilities for a more meaningful and comprehensive approach to both the research and Emma's treatment. "There's one more thing," Emma said as Dr. Mitchell was preparing to leave. "I'd like to be involved in the research process, not just as a subject or a beneficiary, but as a participant. I want to understand what you're doing and why." Sarah smiled. "I think that's an excellent idea. Science is always better when it's a collaborative effort." As Dr. Mitchell drove away that night, she found herself both excited and nervous about the new direction the research would take. What had started as a straightforward agricultural study was evolving into something far more complex and potentially impactful. George stood on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the ranch road. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe freely. The weight of secrets had been lifted, and while the path ahead was uncertain, at least they were all walking it together. Inside the house, Emma was already researching medical journals on her laptop, determined to understand every aspect of the science that might help her condition. Her grandfather had given her something precious, not false hope, but the opportunity to be an active participant in her own potential healing. The Strait Ranch had always been a place where hard work and patience yielded results. Now it was about to become something more, a place where science, hope, and family love would converge in pursuit of answers that might change not just Emma's life, but the lives of countless others facing similar challenges. 3 weeks later, the Strait Ranch had been transformed into an impromptu research campus. Dr. Mitchell had assembled a team that included Dr. James Patterson, a microbiologist from the UT Health Science Center, and Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a specialist in autoimmune disorders from Houston Methodist Hospital. The collaboration had received preliminary approval from the university's ethics board, with the understanding that any promising findings would require extensive additional testing before potential therapeutic applications could be explored. Emma had thrown herself into the research with the same determination she'd once applied to rodeo competition and academic achievement. Despite the fatigue that still plagued her some days, she was present for every sample collection, took detailed notes during team meetings, and had even learned to operate some of the basic testing equipment. "Emma, your documentation skills are better than most graduate students I've worked with," Dr. Patterson commented as she handed him a meticulously organized folder of soil sample data. "Have you considered a career in research science?" Emma smiled, though the question carried weight beyond its casual delivery. "I've been thinking about it more lately. This whole experience has shown me how much I enjoy the investigation process." Michael watched his daughter's renewed energy and purpose with mixed emotions. He was grateful to see her engaged and hopeful, but he worried about what would happen if the research didn't yield the results they were all hoping for. Dr. Rodriguez had been particularly impressed with the systematic approach the Strait family had taken to land management over the generations. The consistent grazing patterns and organic matter management have created some unique soil conditions, she explained to the family during their weekly progress meeting. "We're seeing bacterial communities that we've never encountered in other ranch environments." "Is that good or bad?" Rebecca asked, her nursing background making her naturally cautious about unknown microorganisms. "It's potentially very good," Dr. Mitchell replied. "These unique communities have evolved specifically in response to your family's land management practices. They've had over a century to develop symbiotic relationships with the plants and animals on this property." George leaned forward in his chair. "And what does that mean for the medical applications we're hoping to explore?" Dr. Rodriguez chose her words carefully, We've isolated several bacterial strains that show interesting properties in preliminary laboratory tests. Some appear to have anti-inflammatory characteristics, while others seem to modulate immune system responses in ways that could be beneficial for autoimmune conditions. But, Dr. Patterson added, we're still months away from understanding whether these properties could translate into actual therapeutic benefits for humans. Emma nodded, having learned to appreciate the careful precision with which the scientists discussed their findings. What's the next step in the research process? We need to cultivate these bacterial strains in laboratory conditions and test their effects on immune system cells in controlled environments, Dr. Rodriguez explained. If those tests show promise, we'd need to move to animal studies, and only after that could we even consider human trials. The timeline was daunting, potentially years before any definitive answers would be available. But Emma had found that having a concrete plan and being an active participant in the research gave her a sense of control that had been missing from her traditional medical treatment. That afternoon, as the research team worked in the field, Emma joined her grandfather for their daily horse ride. Despite her joint stiffness, riding remained one of the activities that consistently made her feel like herself. "Grandpa, I want to thank you," she said, as they paused to rest the horses near the old creek bed where the most promising soil samples had been collected. "Thank me for what, sweetheart?" "For believing that there might be answers we haven't found yet. For not just accepting that this is as good as it gets." George studied his granddaughter's face, noting that while she still showed signs of fatigue, there was a light in her eyes that had been missing for months. "Emma, even if this research doesn't lead to a treatment for your condition, it's already accomplished something important." "What's that?" "It's given you back your fighting spirit. You're not just a patient anymore. You're a researcher, an advocate for yourself and others with similar conditions. That's worth something, regardless of what we find in the soil." Emma considered this perspective. "Do you think Dad is starting to see it that way too?" George glanced toward the field, where Michael was helping the research team set up equipment. "Your father is a practical man, like his grandfather was. It takes him time to warm up to new ideas, but he's starting to see how this project has affected you positively." Indeed, Michael's attitude toward the research had evolved significantly over the past few weeks. While he remained cautious about raising false hopes, he couldn't deny that Emma's involvement in the project had given her a sense of purpose and energy that her traditional medical treatment alone hadn't provided. That evening, Dr. Mitchell presented the family with preliminary findings that were more promising than anyone had dared to hope. "We've identified 3 bacterial strains that show significant anti-inflammatory properties," she explained, displaying microscopic images on her laptop. "One in particular, which we're calling Bacillus straitensis, appears to produce compounds that could help regulate overactive immune responses." "You named it after our family?" Emma asked, clearly delighted. "It seemed appropriate, given that it was discovered on your land, and you've been such an integral part of the research process," Dr. Patterson replied with a smile. Rebecca, ever practical, asked the question that everyone was thinking. "What does this mean for Emma's treatment options?" Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. "That's where things get complicated. We can't recommend any changes to Emma's current treatment based on preliminary laboratory findings. However, we are going to propose a collaborative study with Emma's medical team to explore whether these discoveries could inform future therapeutic approaches." Emma's rheumatologist, Dr. Susan Hayes, had been kept informed about the research project and had agreed to participate in the collaborative study. She had been cautiously optimistic about the findings while emphasizing the importance of maintaining Emma's current treatment protocol. "The most important thing, Doctor," Hayes had told the family during a conference call earlier that week is that Emma continues to respond well to her current medications while we explore these additional possibilities. We can't let hope for future treatments compromise her current health management. As the weeks progressed, the research project began attracting attention from the broader scientific community. Dr. Mitchell received inquiries from researchers at universities across the country who were interested in similar studies on other historic ranch properties. The potential for discovering therapeutically useful microorganisms in carefully managed agricultural environments was beginning to be recognized as a legitimate and promising field of study. We might be looking at the beginning of a whole new approach to finding natural therapeutic compounds, Dr. Patterson explained to a group of visiting researchers from Colorado State University. Properties like the Strait Ranch, with their long history of consistent, sustainable land management, could be treasure troves of undiscovered microorganisms. Emma found herself serving as an unofficial ambassador for the research, explaining to visitors how the project had evolved from her grandfather's determination to help her with her autoimmune condition. Her articulate descriptions of both the scientific process and the personal impact of the research impressed everyone who met her. Emma has become the heart of this project. Dr. Mitchell confided to George during one of their regular check-ins. Her enthusiasm and understanding of the science have inspired everyone involved. George watched his granddaughter explaining bacterial cultivation techniques to a graduate student from Texas A&M and felt a profound sense of pride. Even if the research didn't ultimately lead to a treatment for Emma's condition, it had already transformed her from a patient into a scientist, from someone affected by illness into someone actively working towards solutions. The collaboration between the Strait family and the research team had created something neither side had anticipated, a model for how personal motivation, scientific rigor, and family determination could combine to explore new frontiers in both agriculture and medicine. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of cooler weather and the annual cycle of ranch life, the research project was preparing to enter its next phase. The preliminary findings would be published in peer-reviewed journals, potentially opening doors for expanded studies and eventually clinical trials. But for the Strait family, the most important outcome wasn't the potential for scientific publication or medical breakthroughs. It was the transformation they had witnessed in Emma and in their understanding of what it meant to fight for the people you love. 6 months after Dr. Mitchell's first visit to the ranch, the Strait family found themselves hosting what had become known in scientific circles as the Texas Soil Symposium. Researchers from across the country had gathered to discuss the implications of the ranch-based research and its potential applications for both agriculture and medicine. Emma, now 18 and preparing for college, had been invited to present her documentation of the research process to the assembled scientists. Standing before an audience of PhDs and medical professionals, she displayed a confidence and knowledge that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. "When my grandfather first decided to allow research on our ranch," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I thought he was just being generous to the scientific community. I had no idea that he was actually fighting for my future in the most creative way he could imagine." The audience listened intently as Emma described not just the scientific findings, but the personal journey that had brought her family to this point. She spoke about the challenges of living with an autoimmune condition, the importance of maintaining hope while accepting uncertainty, and the unexpected ways that scientific collaboration had strengthened her family bonds. Dr. Rodriguez, who had become something of a mentor to Emma over the months of research, watched with pride as her young collaborator fielded technical questions from senior researchers with ease and sophistication. "Miss Strait," asked Dr. Elizabeth Chen from Stanford University, How has your involvement in this research affected your health management and your outlook on your condition? Emma paused thoughtfully before responding. It's given me agency in my own health story. Instead of just being someone with lupus, I'm someone who's actively working to understand lupus and potentially help find solutions for others dealing with similar challenges. That sense of purpose has been as important for my well-being as any medication. George, sitting in the back of the conference room with Michael and Rebecca, felt tears welling up in his eyes. His granddaughter had become an advocate not just for herself, but for everyone facing chronic health challenges. The research project had accomplished far more than he had dared to hope when he first reached out to Dr. Mitchell. The scientific findings had indeed been significant. 3 bacterial strains discovered in the ranch soil had shown promising anti-inflammatory and immune-modulating properties in laboratory studies. One strain, Bacillus straitensis, had demonstrated particular promise for autoimmune condition management and was moving toward animal trials. But perhaps more importantly, the collaborative research model developed at the Strait Ranch was being replicated at historic properties across the country. The intersection of traditional land management, agricultural science, and medical research was opening entirely new avenues for therapeutic discovery. Dr. Mitchell, now leading a multi-university consortium studying ranch-based microbiomes, had received a major research grant to expand the work to 50 historic properties across Texas, Montana, and Wyoming. The Strait Ranch remained the flagship site, with Emma serving as a student researcher while pursuing her undergraduate degree in biochemistry. The beauty of this approach, Dr. Mitchell explained to the symposium attendees, is that it honors traditional knowledge while applying cutting-edge scientific methods. Families like the Straits have been managing their land sustainably for generations, creating unique ecological conditions that we're only now learning to appreciate. As the formal presentations concluded, the attendees gathered on the ranch porch for an evening reception. The setting sun painted the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and the sounds of cattle and horses provided a peaceful backdrop to conversations about bacterial cultures and immune system modulation. Emma found herself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher from Johns Hopkins who was interested in establishing a similar collaboration with a historic ranch in Maryland. Emma, your documentation and insights have been incredibly valuable to our understanding of how personal motivation can drive scientific innovation, Dr. Williams said. Have you considered pursuing graduate research in this field? Actually, I have, Emma replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I want to study the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and modern medical research. There might be answers in the practices our grandparents took for granted that modern science is only now sophisticated enough to understand. George, overhearing this conversation, smiled to himself. His granddaughter had found not just hope for her own condition, but a life's mission that would potentially help countless others. Michael approached his father, carrying 2 bottles of beer and wearing an expression that was equal parts gratitude and amazement. Dad, I owe you an apology. For what, son? For doubting your judgment about this research project. I was so focused on protecting our traditions that I almost missed the opportunity to honor them in a completely new way. George accepted the beer and looked out over the ranch that had been his family's home for over a century. Michael, sometimes the best way to preserve tradition is to let it evolve. This land has always been about taking care of family and community. We're just doing that in a way our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Rebecca joined them, her arm around Emma's shoulders. I think the most remarkable thing about all of this is how it's brought our family closer together. We went through some difficult times when Emma was first diagnosed, but this project has given us a way to face challenges as a team. Emma looked up at her mother. It's also taught me that having a chronic condition doesn't mean I have to live a limited life. I can use my experience to help others and contribute to scientific understanding. As the evening progressed, the researchers gradually departed, leaving the Strait family alone on their porch as they had been countless times before. But this time, the conversation was different. Instead of worrying about Emma's health or the future of the ranch, they found themselves planning her college course load and discussing the next phase of the research project. "Grandpa," Emma said as they watched the last car disappear down the ranch road, "do you think we'll actually find a treatment for lupus in the soil?" George considered the question carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I know we've already found something just as valuable." "What's that?" "We've found a way to turn uncertainty into possibility. We've learned that fighting for the people you love sometimes means taking risks and trying approaches that other people might think are crazy. Most importantly, we've discovered that hope is something you create through action, not something you wait around for." Emma nodded, understanding exactly what her grandfather meant. The research project had given her more than potential medical treatments. It had given her a sense of control over her future and a way to transform her personal challenges into contributions to the broader community. 6 months later, Emma would start her freshman year at the University of Texas, majoring in biochemistry with a focus on environmental microbiology. She would continue to work with the research team during summer breaks, and her senior thesis would examine the therapeutic potential of microorganisms found in sustainable agricultural environments. Dr. Rodriguez would successfully complete the first animal trials of Bacillus straitensis, with results promising enough to warrant human clinical trials. The process would take years, but the foundation for potentially revolutionary treatments had been established. Michael would gradually transform portions of the ranch into a research and education center, hosting student groups and offering workshops on sustainable land management. The ranch would remain a working cattle operation, but it would also become a living laboratory for studying the intersection of agriculture and medicine. Rebecca would return to nursing, specializing in working with patients and families dealing with chronic conditions. Her experience with Emma's journey and the research project would inform her approach to helping others navigate the complexities of long-term health management. And George would continue to serve as the patriarch of a family that had learned to face challenges with creativity, collaboration, and unwavering determination. His decision to pursue an unconventional approach to helping his granddaughter had not only potentially contributed to medical science, but had also strengthened the bonds between 4 generations of Straits. As they sat on the porch that night, watching stars appear over the ranch that had sheltered their family for more than a century, each member of the Strait family understood that they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had taken a leap of faith together, and regardless of what the future held, they had already succeeded in the most important way possible. They had refused to accept limitations and had fought for hope with everything they had. The hidden harvest that George had sought in the ranch soil had yielded more than he could have imagined. It had produced not just potential medical treatments, but a transformation in his family's understanding of what it meant to face adversity together. The century-old land had indeed held answers, but they weren't just buried in the soil. They were found in the willingness to look for them, to take risks for love, and to believe that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the places and people we know best. Emma's lupus would remain a part of her life, but it would no longer define her limitations. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a journey that would potentially help countless others facing similar challenges. The research that began with a grandfather's desperate hope had evolved into a model for how personal determination, scientific rigor, and family love could combine to create possibilities that none of them could have imagined alone. The Strait Ranch would continue its legacy of caring for the land and the people who called it home. But now that legacy would extend far beyond the fence lines, reaching into laboratories and medical centers where the discoveries made in Texas soil would offer hope to families around the world facing their own battles with illness and uncertainty. In the end, George's hidden motive had been revealed to be the most transparent truth of all, that a family's love knows no boundaries and that sometimes the greatest gifts we can give each other are not answers, but the courage to keep searching for them together.